for coming to another seminar for our Economies seminar. I'm really stoked today because my friend Dylan Saba is going to be presenting, and I'm going to let him introduce himself in a second. And yeah, we have a handful of events coming up, but the one I really want to note is that on October 26th with the Red Clinic and the Green Clinic. Red Clinic is in the UK, and the Green Clinic is in Brooklyn. We're going to be holding an event, probably as Hannah just told me, which is probably definitely true, the only event in any psychoanalytic institutes about genocide and the politics of genocide. Um, and on that note, we also released on Friday our Palestine issue, and I know we have a link we're going to drop to that. And I just want to say that none of the money is going to parapraxis. It's all going to the Gaza Community Mental Health Program. And if you want to donate directly to that program, that makes a ton of sense to me. That said, the writers in the issue did their really did really well to try to clarify the situation from within our discursive ambit, and I'm really proud of the writers, and I think they did an incredible job. And I think it all the pieces are online already, and you can read them for free. We just want to have the newspaper available and distributed for people to read um, as well. Yeah, I hope everybody's doing okay. It's a crazy time. I think that's just worth affirming. And yeah, Dylan, I'll let you take from here. You can introduce yourself. And oh yeah, the text we're reading is Everybody Wants to Be a Fascist by Deleuze and Guattari. Okay. Or by Guattari, actually. But go ahead, Dylan.
Thanks, Alex. And thanks everyone for being here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Really grateful to Alex and Hannah and everyone in the parapraxis world for inviting me on to talk about this text. My name is Dylan Saba. My day job is as a staff attorney for Palestine Legal. I'm a civil rights attorney representing folks in the Palestine Solidarity Movement who are facing repression for all kinds of activism across the US. And I'm also a writer. I write freelance for various publications. I want to do a bit of throat clearing before we get into the text because it'll make me feel better. But I wanted to start by saying that I'm not an academic. I'm not a practitioner of psychoanalysis. I'm not even really particularly well read in the field. And so I really just want to work through this text as a reader and think through it with you all. It's a very appropriate text for the moment in some ways, and kind of inappropriate in others. But again, I'm grateful to share space with you all, and really look forward to sharing my reading of this text and also hearing from you all. And this is not my expertise, and so my reading here should not be taken as authoritative in really any respect, but hopefully it will be generative. The other thing I'll say is that I am interested in Palestine. That's what I'm thinking about most of the time. I'm thinking about Palestine and also this particular historical conjuncture, and the United States, and our as a nation, our role in it and in supporting the atrocities that we're seeing every day. So those are the examples that are front of mind to me, and probably what I'm going to be drawing most on. Um, yeah. So okay, why this text? Um, it's pretty clear that fascism is all around us. Um, we have now passed the 1 year mark of the onset of the genocide in Gaza, and it's not going anywhere. In fact, it's spreading. We've now seen the genocide spread to Lebanon and escalation in the region that is terrifying. And really, I think it's not an understatement to say is, risking like truly opening up the pits of hell. Um, we are bracing for an Israeli attack on Iran that is likely to escalate into a full blown regional war involving nuclear powers. I mean, it's on the one hand, it's really important and worth asking how we got here, and what are the forces that have crafted or contributed to the situation. Um, on another hand, it feels kind of silly to be like chin stroking about fascism, particularly in the kind of, you know, flowery and bizarre way that Guattari like and Deleuze like to write about it. Um, so I'm just going to sit with that and not really resolve it, because I'm not really sure what else to do at this moment. Like many of us are. Um, anyways, so okay, let's get a little bit more into it. I want to just have make some brief remarks before we get into this text in particular about Guattari and really Deleuze and Guattari. Not like biographical stuff, which you can look up on your own. And again, as not an academic, I'm not really that interested in. Like, um, I'm not interested in um, really like engaging with these guys as thinkers in the canon so much as I am trying to mine the text for useful things in thinking about the present. Um, but just like kind of my approach to them. So I first started reading these guys not that long ago, really, like in 2020. And I got there because I was trying to figure out what the economy is and how it works, which is, I guess, appropriate for the theme of this series. Um, I don't even remember how I got there from that question, but I ended up reading A Thousand Plateaus, and that was my first like real foray into these thinkers, and it really blew me away. Um, and I knew that I wasn't really understanding most of it as I was reading it, but it was so like lyrical and strange and fundamentally compelling that I had to keep going. And I because I really wanted to understand um, what it is that they were saying. Um, and their mode of philosophy is quite hostile to analogy and comparison. And as a result of that, we get a ton of like bespoke concepts that they introduce that all tend to overlap with one another, um, which makes things very confusing when you're first trying to dig into the text. But once you start to see the bigger picture, it's actually extremely cool. The way that they introduce concepts and situate them in a system. Um, but there's also the risk with them that the process of figuring out what it is the fuck they're saying becomes like the end in itself, which I think is the challenge. So like they may, achieve something very precise, but it's easy to spend so much effort trying to um, literally understand that process of achieving clarity feels like a philosophical insight when it's actually just the first step of like, okay, now that I now that I know what they're saying, is this actually good or useful? So I always like to just like when I'm when I have an aha moment, I'm like, am I saying aha because I understood what they're saying, or am I saying aha because it's right? Um, anyways, um, so there's all these bespoke concepts which can make it hard to enter a text. Um, and I don't know how much all have read them. So maybe, this is just like totally familiar and you're used to their network of concepts or what have you. Um, but if you're not, I think like before we talk about this one, I think the one of the main concepts from their work that shows up here that is important to spell out at the beginning is this concept of the molar versus the molecular, because we hear a lot about molecular formations in this text, and it's describing all kinds of things as molecular without really explaining what it is that means. Um, so for them, when they're talking about the molar versus the molar is like basically um, big categories like that are homogeneous, right? So if you think about like the category of the worker, that is a molar category. Like a worker is a worker is a worker. Um, a capitalist is a capitalist. There are, this is a kind of a large homogeneous structure. Whereas the molecular is heterogeneous and specific, right? So it's a specific worker with their specific wants or desires. Like these are things that are happening at the molecular level, and it's kind of helpful to just think about it literally in terms of like the microscope, right? So if you have I don't know, like a sheet of paper or something. It's like a big, 8 by 11 white sheet of paper that looks like totally homogeneous. And then if you put it under a microscope, who knows what the hell is crawling all over it or something. You can see it. You zoom in and you see that it is actually not homogeneous. It's differentiated, and there's all kinds of little things crawling about. So when they're talking about, when Guattari is talking about the molecular, he means action that's happening at a zoomed in level, a very specific level that is differentiated and heterogeneous, as opposed to the bigger categories. Okay, so let's get into the text. Everybody wants to be a fascist. Now, I think one of the first things that I notice about this text is that it's got this very provocative title, and kind of it purports to be about fascism, and it kind of is about fascism, but he at the very beginning he indicates that really what he wants to talk about is desire, and that makes sense in like the kind of broader DNG corpus, right? There, what he's getting at in his discussion of desire early on, um, is the foundation of their approach to metaphysics when Deleuze and Guattari write together in Anti-Oedipus, which is like basically around the same time period that this lecture is written. So they want to reconceptualize what desire is, really put it at the center of their metaphysics, through their concept of desiring production, and they build out a whole ontology around that. And for Guattari, talking about fascism is like a cheeky at this moment in time. By this I mean the time that it's written, is like a cheeky way to get to that, by tracing how fascism operates on the molecular level and through the kind of like libidinal flows that are essential to their metaphysics. He's like, in a very, kind of epic way, is bringing you along on this story um, of the flows of desire. So, but in thinking, it's kind of funny because why are we reading this text now? Because fascism is everywhere. So it's actually not that subversive. It doesn't land in the same kind of subversive way that it maybe did in the 70s, because it's like, yeah, obvious, it's not a controversial statement to point at things and call them fascist in 2024. In the way that it may have been, um, you know, a couple decades after the end of World War II and the collapse of the Nazi regime. But anyways, like, so okay, so you know, on the tin, it's saying it's about fascism, but at the very beginning, we start with Guattari saying, okay, what we're here to do is to formulate a micropolitics of desire. Um, and that's going to be the thing that either beats or most effectively contains fascism where other structures have failed to do so. Um, and it makes it kind of a weird place to start, right? Because we don't we don't even know what fascism is. I mean, like we know we are kind of he's signaling that that the kind of fascism he's going to talk about is going to be different than what we're accustomed to. Is going to be operating on a different level. But before we even hear about what that is, we're hearing about what's going to be the thing, the answer to it. Which is confusing if it's actually about fascism, but not that confusing if really what it is about is mapping out desire in correctly, right? So before we find out what a micropolitics of desire is, we hear about what it's not, and that kind of clues us into who Guattari is writing against, or like what where he's identifying, the theoretical barriers, which will become clear throughout the text. But from the very beginning, we learn that it's not a micropolitics of desire. Excuse me. Um, is not a synthesis of Marxism and psychoanalysis. And I think he means that in a very like literal sense of we are not trying to produce a bridge between these um, theoretical doctrines that makes them mutually intelligible or translatable. And that makes sense given what we're saying um, about how Deleuze and Guattari think about conceptual infrastructure, right? They don't want a unified theory of everything. They want all kinds of bespoke concepts that are going to evolve, that are going to change, and that may be translatable across time, but in specific ways. In general, I mean, these guys have a pretty robust hostility towards totalizing structures at every level. So they always want to say, yes, this is a structure, but it exists along with all kinds of other things. And at the highest level of abstraction for them, in their metaphysics, is a kind of flattening of structures, of individuals, of non-structures, of events, kind of all at the same all at the same horizon, which they like variously refer to with all kinds of funny names. One of which is like the body without organs. Um, but so what they want to say is like, okay, well, we're not gonna pose a theory of desire that is sensible in the language of psychoanalysis and of Marxism, and can make them talk to each other. Um, and so when we talk about desire, we are talking about something else that doesn't mean desire in the way that psychoanalysis means desire. And this you can kind of tell is the main um, motivation for Guattari, right? He's like, how you all are talking about desire is wrong. And again, I'm not well read in the canon of psychoanalysis, so I'm gonna, what I'm saying here is like this is what I read him to be saying. I'm not endorsing his like screeds against the canon. I'm kind of just interpreting them. Um, but what he seems to be saying is that okay, um, you all think that desire is lack, that we desire something because we don't have it, and that's a very reductive framework, but I think is like broadly speaking how he interprets the meaning of desire in the language of psychoanalysis. And so okay, like it's one thing to say desire is not lack, and many people have said that, including in like the philosophical canon. But then so like okay, then what is it, right? Um, and so one option, one possible philosophical explanation of desire that I think is or like I read to be like partially compelling to someone like Deleuze at least is the desire or the vision of desire that is like traceable to the philosophy of Spinoza, which is like desire as conatus or like the will to continue existing, basically. So it's not that you know desire means lack; it means a desire to continue to exist as such, and so what things desire is more power to keep existing as themselves, um, which poses like a really big problem for Spinoza, which is that okay, well, if that's true, then how come some things seem to desire their own destruction? Which is like famously the question that Spinoza in his political writings is like, what's up? What's going on here? And I take Spinoza's answer to be that people are stupid, and just generally confused about things, and they like need to do a much better job at studying the order and connection of things, and achieving clarity, and then they can all, expand their power of action together. It's not really a very satisfying answer, I think, for Deleuze and Guattari, who see people acting in ways that are, uh, pushing in the direction of their own destruction, and the idea that they're just confused, or like misinterpreting facts about things is unsatisfying. And I think we can see, why that is. But there's also other available concepts of desire, that I think these guys like variously pick up and put down. There's like desire as only a death drive. There's an idea that um, okay, it's the conatus, but we have to destroy it because individuals are bad. And like things shouldn't. I don't know. There's all like there's all kinds of crazy guys, who had all kinds of ideas um, about what desire is. Like maybe there are good desires and bad desire, like two different kind of desiring forces. Um, but okay, so but DNG like they don't want to. They kind of like they're not interested in any of those really, because what they see out in the world, is I guess let me just go to text. So what Guattari writes is that there actually is no desire in itself. So all of these theories are wrong because desire is actually not a thing that you can point to and say like, okay, there it is. There is the force that is compelling individuals to act. Okay, so then what is he talking about? What are we writing about if there is no desire in itself? Um, and their answer is to decenter the individual. So they say, okay, it's actually not individuals that are desiring, but um, but really what we're talking about is things in connection with each other. And so the ontology that they build out of this is really a philosophy of assemblages, so things in connection with each other. And they want to point to those connections between things in relationship with each other, and say it is desire. That connection itself is the force of desire. So we actually can't understand what desire is outside of the relationship between objects or things or individuals that are in conjunction with each other. So, kind of the examples that they use at the start of Anti-Oedipus is like the wasp and the flower and their kind of like biological relationship with each other. And also between like the various machines that make up the human body. So we say machines, we say assemblages. These are basically overlapping ideas for them. Um, and they say, okay, so desire comes out of the connection between machines, between assemblages. Everything is really um, built on top of machines at different levels of abstraction, really. So not just at the very concrete and physical level of abstraction, but also various social machines that fit together. And so, if we want to understand desire, we have to understand how it is that these various assemblages interact with each other. And notably, then, like it doesn't really have a moral valence to it, right? It's not that like things want to, continue existing and they fuck it up by being dumb. And so we have to fix that, or it's not like things just want to die. And so we have to, be smart and prevent that or allow it or whatever it is. It's like things just want to connect because they're following, okay, and then we'll get to that. What are they following? But things want to connect. And, we're not going to understand desire, which is the like dominant motivating force of all things, unless we see how it is that they connect and what conditions they connect, why they're connecting, etc. Okay, so what is governing these connections then? So what are they? What makes things connect with each other and do the things that they want to do? And Deleuze and Guattari call the formulas that govern these connections abstract machines. So if you're reading Deleuze and Guattari and you encounter abstract machines, it's like really what they mean by that um, are diagrams, basically. And this is like kind of downstream of the fact that at least for Deleuze, like the world is an ordered one in that it is governed by a series of causes. And this is like directly from Spinoza, basically, that the world is broadly determined, and it's determined because things exist in causal relationships with each other. Now, at the nitty gritty, he kind of like doesn't. There's some qualifications there, but like broadly speaking, that's the world. And how those, there's all kinds of like basically mathematical formulas for how it is that those things, that those structures of causation works, and because it's determined, we can deduce them. We can figure it out. We can figure out like what the abstract machines are. And like that is in many respects like the object of science, and for Deleuze, like the object of philosophy. So one example would be like evolution, right? So the tendency of life to develop and complexify, what have you, um, in um, in the way that we know or think to know that evolution works, right, is an example of an abstract machine. You can draw a diagram of you can draw a Punnett square, right? And that doesn't exist anywhere out in the world, but organisms kind of follow it by virtue of their properties. And so the connections that form as a result of that are where desire is, basically. Okay, so because that this realm of desire is like morally neutral, um, it can have good outcomes and it can have bad outcomes. It can produce like, safety, it could produce terror, what have you, and it does, right? Like this is the world that we live in. So the project then for him is okay, well, if this is how things work, what can we what can we do about it, right? How can we inject politics into this world of desire? And that's what he's really trying to do with the micropolitics of desire. And then we can kind of, it makes more sense than why he's saying that neither psychoanalysis nor Marxism really gets what's going on here and is like ill-equipped to be able to do this, because both of these doctrines are like take desire to be maybe downstream of some of the like molar categories, like the molar aggregates. So for psychoanalysis, maybe that's like the Oedipal structure, like the mommy daddy, what have you, and for Marxism, like the big class categories. So they might say that desire is like produced in the conditions of these of these structures in a kind of top down approach. And he's saying like that's missing. I don't think he's saying these things are wrong, but he's saying what's missing is the approach to understanding the politics of desire, that comes from the bottom up, from the little connections that end up having an impact on some of the broader systems and categories. And that's really what that's what the rest of the essay is about, is trying to trace out, or I don't even know if he traces it out, but at least speak to the ways in which the desire at the level of those lower order assemblages end up impacting the politics of broader social formations. Um, yeah, and so he sees fascism, although he doesn't really we don't really ever get a definition of what this like molecular fascism is. But he, what he describes as a form of despotism in these smaller interactions and smaller assemblages and structures. He sees like despotism in there everywhere, and up the chain, right? So there is like the despotism of the bourgeois state, of the bureaucracy, but then down to like the academy, familiar power, phallocratic power in male-female relationships, he writes, or even on like the sub-individual level. So the repressive power of the superego over the individual. Um, so this is like really like the first clue that we get into what does he mean when he's talking about fascism that exists on the molecular level, or on the level of the individual, the sub individual, is in the operation of these various machines or like assemblages um, on the flows of desire, or really like their operation and the flows of desire are one and the same. And sometimes they're bad, and sometimes they're despotic or fascist, and in fact often they are. Um, and then kind of immediately what jumps out here is a tension that exists in this text and in their broader corpus, which is where like they are so a lot of their writing is setting up these oppositions between like the molar and the molecular, between like these rigid structures that we are familiar with, and that are like homogeneous and are very structured, and the more and as opposed to the rigid, the more kind of like supple molecular, individuated, heterogeneous, the kind of messy reality of things. They're always drawing these contrasts between those two ways of viewing reality and looking at the world. And they kind of always want to jump in to say like we're not saying that you know that the hierarchies are bad, and that the molecular, the specific, the heterogeneous, these things are good. And you shouldn't take that lesson away from our text. But I kind of don't always believe them when they're saying that. And there is this kind of temptation that is like maybe a kind of like anarchist tendency that runs through this text, and elsewhere in their work too, where you can kind of tell that they do think that on some level, or they are kind of extremely hostile to the quote unquote totalitarian structures that they're describing. So here is like one example of that, where Guattari is like, we have to destroy despotism everywhere and fascism everywhere, like up from the individual, all the way up to the you know to the level of society. But then elsewhere they're like, no, like you know it's both. So I just think that's interesting. Okay, so moving forward a bit. So now he wants to talk again about desire, but through this example of understanding fascism. And so he sets up a couple of different ways of understanding what fascism is, um, that fail. And the first one that he points to is what he calls like the analytic formalist approach, which is the kind of like sociological approach to dealing with fascism, of like we're gonna look at all the examples and we're gonna compare them to each other, and we're gonna study them and kind of do categorize them that way, and then we will understand fascism. And I think this is like a familiar kind of discourse. I like it's not so much anymore, but people had like a multi-year long fight about whether Trump was fascist over the past 5 years or so. Um, and a lot of times it kind of took on this tenor of being like, well, like it didn't come from like the fascism region of Italy, and so they like that kind of like feeling to it. And I don't think that it's. I think like this text kind of like shoots a gap in between that fight in a way. Like I don't think that it is a partisan in that debate, and I think that the way that it splits the baby really is to differentiate between microfascism and like the actual totalitarian structure of a fascist state. But anyway, so the we don't even spend much time in this analytic approach, because it's like he's like, this is dumb. Why would we do this? But he has more to say about the next approach that he lays out, which is the neo-Marxist synthetic dualist approach. I'm like, dude, pick a name. But anyways, so with this approach, he's like, okay, the Marxists recognize that, and this is funny because we're already talking about this. We haven't even talked about what fascism is, or like the kind of molecular structure of it. So let's kind of cabin that for a second. But we he's gestured toward the facts that fascism is the like amalgamation of micro-fascisms, of desires that have this like despotic quality among the people. And so he says the Marxist approach is to recognize that, that it is that fascism does kind of come out of the masses, and even maybe is an expression of some kind of revolutionary desire in a way, and revolutionary in a um like a non-polemical sense of like not necessarily like left revolutionary, but of a desire to overthrow, to like upend the structures that exist. um but the Marxists want to say like, okay, well, yeah, that's, this is, it does come from the masses, and it's real, but it needs to be corrected, as it were, or channeled through. Both explained, it needs to be both explained by and channeled through the like appropriate Marxist concepts. Okay, why, maybe it's like, to understand fascism, we need to ask like, well, what's going on with the class? In Marxist terms, what has produced this reaction from the masses, and also, what do we do about it? What we do about it is solve it with Marxist tools. So, the Workers' Party, um, appropriate Marxist theoretical formations, um, that way that we can like restore, we can restore the uh we can restore the masses into like their like appropriate vessels. And then, it can be, their revolutionary desires will be appropriately channeled through parties and slogans, and representative formations. And that's how we'll do it, and that's what's going to work. And he basically is like, well, it didn't work. So L. And also it can't really work, because, and we'll kind of get to why it can't work, but he's like, this is way too rigid. It's way too totalizing. And it's actually like, in comparison with some of the other approaches, namely the fascist totalitarian state and the capitalist state, in responding to these desires, it's the least adaptable. And so it ends up, fucking up big time. Um, so we'll hear more about why it is that doesn't work so well, or didn't work, to like properly constrain or channel the revolutionary desires of the masses into something non-despotic, or non-fascist. But okay, but what he says is, okay, there's a secret third thing, and it's called, this is what we're building, and it's the micropolitics of desire approach. And we're not necessarily rejecting all of these other approaches, like the sociological approach or the Marxist approach, but we're supplementing them. We're decentering them, and we're saying like, we need to add some more theoretical infrastructure here, um, in order to respond appropriately to desire. And actually, what we want to do is not necessarily control people's desires, because that is a fool's errand. But we need to liberate it. We need to liberate it, and we need to allow it to exist in, in its multiplicity, in its heterogeneity, and not try to channel it through a singular representative, a voice, but to be able to recognize it speaking in in a cacophony of different differentiated voices. We're getting a bit woo-woo because it's not really clear what that structure or system is supposed to look like, or how it's supposed to work. But it kind of makes sense that this is where he's at, right? Because um, he's also very much reacting to, the failures of these structures in real time. So the we're still like 2 decades before the collapse of the Soviet Union. Like the failures of Stalinism are pretty recent, and also the concept of internationalism, which this really rhymes with, is also pretty new, at least in its like in the like 1968 um, formulation. Um, so okay, so what is it that he wants to build? It's a non-totalizing unification of struggles. And this is where, it's very clear to me, and like this was my, impression on reading A Thousand Plateaus. I was like, A Thousand Plateaus. I was like, oh, these guys are third worldists. Like they are really, they are they are rejecting the like second world approach to establishing communism, and really they are about embracing heterogeny, embracing the diversity of struggles around the world, not to produce a single program, but to uh, um, act on the resonances that exist to destroy what structures of despotism we can, and produce a differentiated world in its wake. Um, and so, okay, some more language about what it is that we're trying to build here: a multiplicity of desiring machines, not made up of standardized and regulated systems, which can be disciplined and hierarchized in relation to a unique objective. It is stratified according to different social groupings, to classes formed by age groups, sexes, geographic and professional localizations, ethnic oranges, erotic practices, etc. Thus, it does not realize a totalizing unity. It is the univocity of the masses' desires and not their regrouping according to standardized objectives, which lays the foundation for the unity of their struggles. Um, Sounds cool. Again, what that actually looks like. Well, I mean, it was definitely very hard to see then. I have some ideas for where we maybe are like seeing this now. But importantly, um, he says that like we need to, in order to like discern what this is, or like in its function, um, we need to be listening, right? And listening to what the masses are saying, not through a singular representative voice. Like we're kind of rejecting that, saying there is actually no one who can speak on behalf of the masses. And he makes like a cheeky comment about how like, what does it mean that I'm saying that and you're all listening to me lecture? Like, reject what I'm saying. Um, but what he says is we we have to listen to the collective arrangement of enunciation. So there's no single voice, but you have to listen in all kinds of ways that you're not used to listening. So you have to see expression all over, and be able to interpret it, not as a command, but as a like framework of representative or expressive desires. So I find this really interesting. That this is what he's writing in the early 70s, when like the failure, like kind of looking at the failure of 1968 to produce a revolution, he's probably not thinking about this directly, but also like the total failure of Arab nationalism in Palestine to defeat like Israeli despotism, but also at the time of the ongoing Palestinian Revolution, where you have guerrilla groups in Palestine that are taking up armed struggle against against Israel, but are finding common cause ideologically with opponents and antagonists of U.S. empire around the world, right? So like they are trying to collectively enunciate with the North Vietnamese and with Black Americans, and it's really only existing in very nascent forms. It has not yet um, you know, produced a real political formation. But there is a sense that in the wake of the collapse of more totalizing structures, that there's all this stuff lying around. All of these like heterogeneous pieces that were not collected by the totalizing structures on the left or on the right. And there's a sense of like we need to gather these up in a way, and trace the linkages between them and try to produce something political out of it. Um, and I think that this idea does have a legacy. And like you can trace the legacy through to the like in with the collapse of left institutions and the fall of the Soviet Union, the rise of the like movement of movements approach to left organizing, that started in the 90s or what have you, and still continues today, especially in like thinking about um, struggle for climate justice, etc. Um, and but also I think I see it now on the ground in the armed resistance to Israel and in particular to the genocide, right? So um, who is who is Israel fighting, right? I mean, obviously, you have they're fighting the civilians, um, but their military antagonist is the axis of resistance, right? Okay, so what actually is the axis of resistance? Because one of the things, I guess I forgot to mention this, but one of the things that Guattari writes about the failure of left organization and the kind of totalizing structures of them is that they're too bound up in trying to wrestle state power. So part of what the faults of the Marxist approach is that in routing the desires of the masses through the Marxist formulations, they get translated with the objective of the party taking state power, and so all kinds of compromises are made to that end, and that is really seen as the objective, but the role of the state has this all kinds of distorting effects, basically, um, um, on on left politics. And he draws a comparison to the like, to the Oedipal complex as this like distorting whatever. Again, not a psychoanalysis, but person, but the but so okay, so but we have the role of the state here, and so okay, so kind of fast forwarding to the present here, what is the axis of resistance? The axis of resistance is a combination or a constellation of mostly quasi-state and non-state actors. I mean, there's Iran, which is a state actor, but you have Hamas, which is like a nascent state. You have the Houthis in Yemen, which have a claim on state power, but are also still a kind of quasi-state actor. You have the Iraqi resistance, which is a non-state actor. You have Hezbollah, which is also kind of a quasi-state actor. So all of these bodies that are representative of social groupings, but are not state powers, or not all. They're not all state powers, and they represent and act on behalf of people with a diversity of religious, ethnic backgrounds, and also represent people with totally different interests and different approaches. So, like, you have a situation in which a colossal military confrontation was initiated by one of the smallest members of this coalition, being Hamas, and without without the foreknowledge of Iran, and Hezbollah and all of these other groups, and those groups had to react, right? They had to react, um, and they reacted in totally different ways. Iran was like, really insistent on not getting dragged into the fight. The cowboys in Yemen were like, "Fuck it, we're going to war," and started firing um, on commercial ships. Um, pretty soon after, the next day, Hezbollah opened up a solidarity front with Gaza and started firing rockets into northern Israel, but in a very measured way, and also were really not trying to escalate into engagement. But the point being that this is not a um, top-down uh, system where you have a representative leader that is calling the shots, and directing military operations. Now it's funny because people in the region, under most a lot of people can see that, but very critically, the United States can't see that, which has caused a lot of problems, really, because there's a kind of refusal to engage with what's happening, and what this constellation of forces is. And so on both the level of propaganda, like there was a piece in the New York Times, I think yesterday, that was like, oh, the Israelis found the secret document that proves that this is all, that all of these groups are operating in coordination. This is one big Iranian scheme, basically. Um, and and then in terms of practical response, like the foreign policy of Israel, right, and really the United States, is basically treats Iran as the decision maker here, and is like, doesn't really know how to engage politically, with with a system that is not under this totalizing structure with a state power at the head of it. And so therefore, does all kinds of things where it's, trying to pressure Iran to get Hezbollah to stop fighting, trying to, pressure X to do Y and Z, and fails because it doesn't actually fully understand what is this structure that they are up against. Now, I don't bring this in to say, like, well, they did it. Axis resistance made the micropolitics of desire, or that Guattari would even recognize that. But I do think that what he was talking about was the failure of certain approaches to anti-fascist struggle, and that he was largely correct in his diagnosis, and that now, 50 years later, new structures have emerged, and they've emerged along lines that he sketched out. And that's cool, or certainly interesting. Okay, so I'm gonna, I realize I've been talking for a while here. I do want to talk about okay, so we've got fascism as the kind of amalgamation or product of desire that starts at the molecular level. And he lays out different ways that desire is dealt with or captured. by totalitarian regimes at present being in the early 70s. So he says like there's all kinds of ways that structures emerge in order to capture or contain these flows. And the first one that he talks about is capitalism, of course, which should be familiar, but I do think that their formulation of capitalism as or the mode of production as a kind of apparatus for capturing and regulating flows is like an interesting um, way to think about it. Um, and what he says about what he writes about the capitalist system, the capitalist like totalitarian regime, um, is that it's largely a set of axioms that like interpret and regulate the flows of desire, be they like you know economic, non-economic, what have you. Um, and that it's a very adaptive system, right? And it's not, and it is actually non-totalizing, right? So capitalism in D&G's world it's not a totalizing structure. It's a set of axioms, and the set of axioms um, are effective at particularizing and confining different conflicts. So in the capitalist system, what it's good at doing is taking someone's problem and saying that's a you problem, and localizing it to the particular region or particular industry or particular shop floor or what have you, as opposed to allowing those revolutionary desires to snowball into something that threatens the system as a whole. Um, so that's the capitalist, kind of capitalist system. In that system, the military exists really is supposed to exist in the background, and kind of operate behind the scenes to produce what then gets um, identified as just like the magic of the market, right? So that the you're not really supposed to ask, you know, why the price of oil is what it is. That's a product of the market, but meanwhile, behind the scenes, the military apparatus is doing the dirty work to make that the case. This also, in 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 the case of Israel, it's not so much that the military machine, even though it's right next door, is still out of sight, right? And it is like working to produce the demographic facts on the ground that are then the inputs for the capitalist bourgeois democratic system that is taken as a given. Um, Okay, so by contrast to the capitalist regime, like totalitarian regime of capture, you have Stalinism, um, which he's like, this is basically a loser in comparison to capitalism because it's trying to, um, it's really trying to overcode all of these or like bring all of these larger social machines under the aegis of the party, like bring everything under the party, and we're going to direct it and control it from above, and that's how we are going to prevent fascism or keep a lid on the desires of the masses. But because that's basically impossible to do, what ends up happening is a kind of like what he calls a de facto polycentrism, where the whole time the party is trying to intervene and resolve all of these regional and national struggles, and those end up being like where the action is basically, and so it's not successful at keeping a lid on things from the top down, and you have this kind of like de facto um, um, heterogeneous non-totalized system. Um, and and interestingly, he says that the failure of Stalinism or this system actually makes the job of capitalism harder, even though they are like in theory competing systems. But with Stalinism, capitalism has a an enemy. It has a way to deal. It has a way to deal with the masses that at least even though it fails, like has this this like figurehead, this like centralized system. And when Stalinism fails, um, capitalism has a harder time um, managing all of the flows of revolutionary desires that can snowball into fascism. Um, and and so then the kind of third regime of capture of these desires is not even really a regime of capture itself, and this is like capital F fascism. And again, this is where we're getting like distinguishing between like the micro fascism of the like despotic desires at the individual level up to like the capital F fascism of a fascist state. And what he says is that this is like, or what DNG right is that this is the kind of regime that fascism builds for itself. So if the all the micro-fascisms are not dealt with in any way or channeled or recognized, and they are allowed to proliferate, that what results is this kind of cancerous body, because all of the despotic micro-fascisms start resonating together, and you get this like bottom up structure that takes root, and it's produced by all of the everything that has like not been channeled into the capital system and capitalist flows. And they talk about like black holes resonating together, and I don't know how useful like that imagery is, because they're like super, they like really are intense about it. But I do think that we can see that the concept of fascism as like a mass movement and as like a ground up movement like does resonate. Like that does make sense, right? Like, um we can look at Trumpism and Trump, right? Like Trump did not produce Trumpism. Like clearly what he is saying and doing is resonating amongst a lot of nodes that pre-existed him, right? Which is not saying they kind of he writes about this specifically with respect to Hitler. It's not to say that individuals don't matter, or that they don't affect the course of history. They do crystallize these forms, these like totalitarian regimes, but they crystallize them because it is crystallized onto them. So by speaking through these resonances, he is empowered in a way to like shape this totalitarian regime that's being produced. And so, what did he say about this regime, the fascism regime? He says, well, one, that it's very flexible. So he calls it transhistorical, and saying that like because it is kind of the absence of the success of these other regimes, it's a thing that has existed across historical periods. He's like, this is this formation had its roots in the Inquisition and kind of shows up here and there and everywhere. Um, and it changes. And it changes according to the circumstance, and is always being transformed by these molecular flows, like the actual nuances of the desires of the masses. Um, and we see this kind of like bottom up formulation of fascism really clearly in Israel today as well. I think it's very striking that when people lament Netanyahu and his governance during this war, um, like the discourse often proceeds like, okay, well, you know, why is Israel doing this? Like, why are they escalating in this way? like opening up new fronts, bringing on new violence in a way that feels, it feels irrational, or at least like the logic to it is not evident on the surface. And the next sentence is always like, well, Netanyahu is only concerned about his political survival, and is not concerned about the well-being of the nation. Well, it's like, well, wait a minute. Like, why would that? Why would killing everyone ensure his political survival, right? Unless there's something nuts going on in terms of like what it is that the polity wants, or that the base wants. Like, why would it be more popular, to bring all of this horrific violence? And the answer is because that there is a crystallized totalitarian fascist regime that is built on the individual micro-fascist desires of regular voting Israelis. And we can talk about why that is, or how it got there. But I do think it's worth emphasizing that really is, a kind of bottom up approach. And we also see that in, there's like a tendency that Guattari names of wanting to conflate between a military dictatorship and this kind of like fascist totalitarian regime of control. But he points out that actually they're different, and sometimes and in antagonism with each other. Right. So like, the fascist figureheads often will pay lip service to the military as an institution, but there's often these hostilities between them, right? So like, think about Trump and the generals always fighting with each other. There's like one of the largest political cleavages within Israeli politics is between the kind of more explicitly fascist political elite and the military and intelligence communities, right? So they actually want they want different things. I mean, Hitler himself was also not a military guy. He had those relationships and what have you, but it's actually something else, like that he's drawing on, and it speaks again to this concept of fascism as really something that is bottom up as much, or if not more, much more so than it is imposed from the top down. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit so that we can get into some discussion. So we've talked a bit about what, how this text can help us understand the present. But I want to just like pull out another concept that it's not really named so specifically here, but shows up throughout the Deleuze and Guattari corpus, that I think is really helpful. And that's this idea of like of slipping the leash. And that's not how they describe it anywhere. But like basically they're constantly describing arrangements, where you have like, organisms or objects in relation to each other in like a steady state relationship. So things are happening the way that they happen because that's what everyone's following the abstract machines, and they are in kind of mutual relation with each other and in a status quo. And but then something happens. There's a mutation, or there is a divergence, and things get knocked out of orbit somehow. And they kind of variously describe this in different ways, but most prominently, there is like a line of flight is what they say. So something acts in a way that was not in accordance with the existing rules of how that particular system operates. And usually, what happens then is that the system then adjusts, right? The rules shift to accommodate this divergence, and a new equilibrium is reached. And that's like the process of deterritorializing. So when an action has like shaken the kind of the earth upon which this system is sitting, um, and then the absorption of the divergence, and the creation of a similar system with different slightly different rules, um, is the re-territorialization of that divergence, into a new status quo. Um, and I think that this framework is really helpful for thinking about what happened on October 7th, right? So why was this, you know, what was October 7th, and why was it so destabilizing? And I think it's interesting here that actually the inspiration for the concept of the line of flight, for Deleuze at least, and this is like, in um, mentioned in Anti-Oedipus, like, actually does come from the concept of the prison break. So Deleuze is like reading George Jackson's prison writings, and although there's like a longer story here, and like there's a weird thing where the footnote is missing, in the Penguin version of Anti-Oedipus, but anyways, the like at least in Deleuze's telling, he's reading George Jackson, and reading George Jackson writing about a prison break, um, and about this kind of like revolutionary desire to flee, but flee and destroy on the way out, basically. So we're gonna break out of here, and we're gonna try and pull things down on the way out. And really finding inspiration, in that. And I think that that's like there's just a really interesting resonance there with October 7th as this massive, large scale prison break, literally, that was so destabilizing, and actually, I think we are still in the moment between the deterritorializing line of flight that disrupted, the steady state that disrupted, and whatever new status quo will emerge, once we've reterritorialized, once things have settled again. Now there's the risk in there, Deleuze and Guattari are always writing about, the risk of absolute deterritorialization. Like, what if you deterritorialize too hard, and there isn't a steady state to return to, or what they call like a line of abolition. Like, we've actually like we've actually broken the gates, so robustly, that the prison doesn't exist anymore. Like, there's nothing to settle onto. Um, and that's really scary. I mean, they're always warning us against it. And I the more this year goes on, the more I'm asking myself, like, what is the status quo that this resolves into? And is there one, or are we in a long period of chaos because of how destabilizing, um, this event was? And I don't know. Um, okay, I think I'm gonna stop. I think I'm gonna stop there. I've been talking for a while, um, and open it up to discussion.
Thank you, Dylan. That was really great. Yeah, I mean, as we typically do, just any questions that people want to raise, and I see that there's already one in the comments. We'll just take them one by one, but also anyone who wants to talk, just raise your hand and we'll get a discussion going. Maybe there's a lot of questions. Oh, yes. Everyone was very patiently waiting. Um, Oh, I also want to ask if I'm happy to read the questions out loud. Also, you can feel free to articulate them yourself. So, Anna, if you want to do that, it's totally fine.
Oh, I don't really have a question. I just wanted to note the connection. And so,
Okay, I'm gonna read it out loud then, just so we have it on the table. Revering the desires of workers, etc., really reminded me of Jackie Wang's Excellent Against Innocence, where she writes, well-meaning leftists who felt obligated to affirm the riots often did so by imposing a narrative of political consciousness and coherence onto the amorphous eruption, sometimes recasting the participants as the proletariat, or dissatisfied consumers whose acts of theft and looting shed light on capitalist ideology. Yeah, I mean, I'd be interested what you have to say about that particular quote, Dylan. But yeah, any other questions or comments? I'm glad to hear them now. I'll just keep Ariel says this may be too specific of a D and G language question, but this description of desire put alongside the collective assemblage of enunciation is making me want to ask what the relationship is between desire and purport. Do you have anything to say to that, Dylan? It's in the comment if you want to read it.
Oh, yeah. I don't know what purport means in this context.
I'm saying so. Uh, an important thing for Guattari that shows up in A Thousand Plateaus, and a few other places, right, is the idea of Helmslow's net, right, which is based off of this linguist, and it's about the relationship between content and expression,
Hmm.
right, and purport is like the undifferentiated thing that exists prior to content and expression. And part of what's interesting about it is that like Deleuze and Guattari ended up making a whole kind of metaphysics about this, right? Like enunciation is in part the process by which this undifferentiated kind of purport thing gets actualized into content and expression. For them, it's not like a linguistic phenomenon. For them, it's like literally descriptive of like how things operate in the world, right? And like the relations between things. But thinking about this from like a psychoanalytic perspective on some level, right? Or just thinking about like there is on like it's close to maybe things that we're dealing with in psychoanalysis because there's this process, at least like linguistically thinking through the Hjelmslav, in which like there's this undifferentiated thing that all of a sudden takes the form this that is based off of some kind of desire to communicate, right? That all of a sudden is structured by this process into language. Because when it's rendered into language, it gains content and it gains expression. So I was just curious, kind of hearing the way that this instance of what in a linguistic context would be a recognizable thing connected to desire, how that might tie to kind of this like broader metaphysicalized linguistic notion that pops up a few times in Deleuze and Guattari. I know Hjelmslaw was more important to Guattari than Deleuze.
That's super interesting. I mean, I like what you had to say about it. But I do think that the way the way that they think about expression as like the thing that binds the subject and object is fascinating. Um, I'm not sure that I like fully understand it. Um, and I know that like Deleuze at least has written a whole uh, book on the meaning of expression in Spinoza's metaphysics, um, that I imagine is like informing some of their thinking on this. But I haven't read that book, and I've heard it's like pretty inscrutable. Um, but yeah. Also on the yeah, I think on the Jackie Wang quote is really interesting. Um, too. Like this desire to punish the masses um for their antisocial behavior insofar as their desires are not channeled through the appropriate categories, as if that's the fault of the masses and not the categories. um, I think that's really interesting.
Jim, you had a question. It reads, how does Guattari see the cultural revolution in terms of this bottom-up versus top-down process? Does he see it as really top-down while giving the appearance of a heterogeneous bottom-up process, or perhaps exactly how fascism forms out of that bottom-up desiring process? I do think that's like a big part of what you spent your time on, Dylan. I was wondering what you thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. I don't know if he's written on the Cultural Revolution or what he would have to say in particular. But I do think that there's like that it can move in both directions, really. That there's no that even that any I think part of what he's saying, right, and saying, in the kind of provocation of the title, is that any system that tries to um, regulate or produce positive political change is going to have to reckon with the microfascisms that exist throughout the masses by virtue of us existing in social relationship with each other. Um, and so, he says like we are not hostile to party action or to state action. Um, and I think recognizes a necessary role for that, but he wants to decenter it in a way of saying like a state action, a party action can work as a part of a like micropolitics of desire approach insofar as it is a part of a broader collective enunciation um, that allows for a kind of multiplicity of desire, flourishing, what have you. So maybe elements of the Cultural Revolution can fit within that system, insofar as they are not the definitive word on socialism, that they don't purport to to speak definitively about what the program is. But insofar as they produce one of several voices, um, I think that's in theory, and probably represents a failure in practical terms. But that's how I would approach the question.
Hmm. Wendy?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dylan. Uh, I'm also not really versed in this literature, and so maybe there's an obvious answer, which I'll be happy for you to provide. But it seems like, on the one hand, Deleuze and Guattari are kind of against the tradition of, the filial, the genealogical, the Oedipal, etc. But I guess I wonder the extent to which their account of fascism can um, fathom or cognize history. And I'm also thinking in terms of the representation of these different non-state actors in the axis of resistance being sort of, I mean, initially when the only actor was like right after October 7th, when the only actor was Hamas, there was a lot of interest in kind of historicizing and understanding the origin of the formation of Hamas, putting it into a kind of historical context. And then as you know, Hezbollah started getting involved and sort of like, well, let's not. We're thinking about them in a sort of lateral way as part of this axis of resistance that's coalitional and actually maybe we don't want to think so specifically about the molecular structure or I don't know if it's the molecular structure or the kind of historical record of the particular actor in that case. But I guess my question is like, well, maybe it's two questions. One, sort of, I guess how you see their account of history in the context of fascism, and two, in the specific case of this moment of trying to think on the left about these different non-state actors that have come together to kind of uh, create this motley axis of resistance, each of which has really different functions and records in their regional context. How how we are or are not supposed to think of each one in terms of its specific legacy, and whether that changes how we think about their sort of horizontal role in the present or something like that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think on the one hand, they want to say that figuring out what is or isn't fascism is not a historian's game. And they want to say that, you know, it's gonna look it actually fascism as a totalizing system is super adaptable and responsive to conditions on the ground. And so if you are looking for example, right, the kind of fascism produced in the fascism region of Italy, then you're probably not going to find it because the conditions have changed and the desire, but like as a system built upon the the desires of individuals, it's gonna the total sum of that is going to look really 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 different. But on the other hand, they want in making the claim that it is a transhistorical structure, like they do need to look back to trace the lineage to say like, okay, well, this is how this regime has developed since the 15th century, and shown up in different places. So they they kind of want to like dismiss the historical approach in terms of figuring out what fascism is. But then once they've figured it out, by, assessing the kind of like, interrelation of desires and structures produced, then they do want to look back, and figure out how it is that we got here. And I think that the kind of same approach would makes sense in terms of thinking about the axis of resistance, right? So it doesn't make sense. It's not useful to say these are all the proxies of Iran, right? That is a flattening approach, a kind of like ahistorical approach that the U.S. and Israel take, in part because of their inadequacy of reading the map, and in part because of their ideological prerogatives. But it also doesn't make sense to view them totally in isolation from one another, right? If you just say Hamas is the legacy of the Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza, and you know that's the lens through which we need to understand its actions, um, and the Houthis have their own legacy, and that the the coordination between them is cynical, right? Is like a political fraud of some kind, and this is actually a common framework of analysis as well, right? So like there are people who are saying like these are all proxies of Iran, and then there are people, saying Hezbollah doesn't give a fuck about the Palestinians, right? Like they are doing their own thing for their own reasons, and it's domestic politics that are governing, and neither one of these approaches is really that useful and has failed. Like each of these approaches has failed to predict what happens next, in really damaging ways, right? Like why was it that Israel thought that they could escalate to de-escalate? Like, why was it that they thought that they could manipulate Hezbollah into delinking their demands from a ceasefire in Gaza? They thought that because they overemphasized Iran's structuring role, and B, because they didn't believe Hezbollah when Hezbollah said that they genuinely care about ending the aggression in Gaza. Um, And so that's what makes me, the failure of both of those analytic frameworks is what makes me think that there's something else here, that there is a that there is a kind of collective enunciation going on, that there is a kind of like multiplicity of desires that cohere as a unity against the fascist aggression in the minimal, like this is like the minimal amount of unity, but it is enough to produce a revolutionary body, like a um, a military structure that can sometimes act in coordination, also sometimes doesn't, right? Like that's also like the crazy thing too, right? After the um, assassination of Fuad Shukr in Beirut, Iran didn't want to respond, right? They were like, no, we need to de-escalate this. Um, we can't risk this kind of escalation, and Hezbollah was like, no, we this is a crossing of all our red lines. We need to like restore our deterrence here, and we are not, we can't allow a new status quo in which these kinds of assassinations can happen. So they did different things, right? Hezbollah responded, Iran didn't. Um, and so there is this like there is this divergence, but also this unity that I think um, is a really it's just a really fascinating political situation, and especially that these are not state powers, and that they're all in this kind of this gray area between like guerrilla formations and state powers.
Mm. Dr. Shira, I read your comment, but I was curious if you wanted to expand upon it here.
So I think there was a point when Dylan, I don't know, I don't remember what you were talking about, but you were saying something, and it just made me resonate very much with Audre. Well, I always quote Audre Lorde and a couple of other folks, Fanon, whatever. So it made me think about how Audre Lorde said the master tools will not destroy the master's house, and how if we are thinking in context of any of the systems in which are present in our world right now, if we think about how we can't really, I think you were talking about like how dang, I wish I remember what I wrote down, what you were saying when I thought it, but I was just thinking about just the interconnectedness with Audre Lorde, Frantz Fanon, and what you were saying regarding sort of maybe revolutionary changes. Maybe you were talking about how I think you were saying something about at what point does something break down too much? Does that resonate, or do you remember? Does anyone remember?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably it was when I was talking about the concept of deterritorialization and what they were drawing from George Jackson. I I it does resonate. I think that part of the challenge with these guys is they are I always want them I always want to read them as writing about colonialism because that's what I care about. Um, and they're often not. And so for me, like but I do think that they're mostly right. They but they don't they like they they are I think organization or liberation for colonized people. I think that they approach it, and but they're casting kind of like a wider gaze and also a narrower one. in that they want to think about, you know, the world economy um, and and building communism, but from the vantage of, looking around in the first world where they are.
I think it
And
was I think it was
okay.
something about like um approaching or ending totalitarian power structures and how either the individual, the collective, or both approach that, as well as like, yeah, there. So I had to go to, well, not had to, but I chose to go to AI to help me sort of put all of the thoughts together. Um, when I think about not just because I think the thing is about decentralizing power structures as well as how do we approach when there's oppression going on.
Mm.
And with Audre Lorde, things that are empowered can't. So this is where you were talking about the top-down approach. The person at the top isn't going to really effectively destroy or get rid of the things that keep them in power, right? So that's why the
Yeah.
master tools can't destroy them, will never destroy the master's house. So that's, I
Mhm.
think, where my thoughts were going.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's right. And if we take the master's tools to be um the kind of molar categories, the existing frameworks that are meant to capture and channel the revolutionary desires of the masses, and translate them back to the masses and saying this is what you're experiencing, um, through ideology, um, then yeah, like totally, like those that will kind of by design, um, never destabilize those structures, or never intend to. And which is why I think the Guattari is um, looking for vulnerabilities at a much smaller level, or thinking about how the kind of seeping out of revolutionary desires out from underneath and through these structures can lead to its destabilization, both for better or for worse.
Hmm. Um, Anella, we have a great conversation going on in the chat, but I think that worth reading. But I just Anella, because you raised your hand. Um,
Thank you so much. I pinky promise it has to do with Audre Lorde and this topic right here. And I'm very sorry to everyone in the chat. I hope we'll get to that. A thing that just crossed my mind is that you just said it's that the master's tools are rather in the molar category, but to me they're inherently molecular because I obviously understand the context in which the master's tools were written. But to me, given that every single one of us lives at the intersections of privileges and oppressions, the master's tools are not really, at least now in this neoliberal capitalist hellscape, they're not really like they can't be really seen as molar because there are so many intersections of violence, and every single one of us perpetuates violence on various axes of identity, that to me, like, it just seems very not disingenuous, not non-generative, but very, it's just not sitting well with me to see the master's tools anymore as this fixed category that we can assign, because I think it takes away the responsibility and accountability of every single one of us perpetuating violence, if you get what I mean. Like that, as you said that, I was like, wait. Can we really see it as a molar or rather as a molecular category? And what kind of, like, what's the consequence of that? Like, how do we see the political implications when we see every single one of us as a true subject of perpetuating violence and not just a recipient of violence for the revolutionary subject and like everything towards liberation? I don't know whether this made sense to you, but you just inspired my little thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think that does resonate, but I also am left with the question of what if we can say that all violence even the violence on the molecular level is a product is the master's tools. Because I think that part of what Guattari is provoking us with is to say that the molecular despotism is not always enforced from the top down, and does kind of emerge organically, as it were, from us being in relation to each other. Now, whether or not that kind of despotism counts or should fit under like the framework of the master's tools, I think is like a very abstract question that I don't know the answer to, or I could see multiple interpretations, and how you articulated it is, that also that resonates.
Ariel?
This might be a really obnoxious thing to say, but maybe it's worth pointing out just as a side bit that like there's a distinction that Deleuze and Guattari present between the idea of like a tool and a weapon. And this is kind of an important passage in A Thousand Plateaus. And they're on the favor of weapons instead of tools. And part of the distinction they make between a tool and a weapon is that a weapon is something like a javelin. It has this projective force that kind of always escapes like purpose or intent, right? So there's a version of this where like there's a very different conception of like what a tool is that's operative that I think would maybe make this like a hard question to pose in some sense to Guattari. But there's this idea that like maybe you can find an unforeseen alliance with almost anything. The question is like, does it put you in a situation where like a bad outcome is like already determined and something is foreclosed on? And I feel like the orientation they have towards that is like, well, there's kind of one way to find out a lot of the time, which is, like look at what that relation is and see what emerges from it. And if it's bad, shut that thing down and find something else. But I think it's very important to not like think of like working in like a molar capacity as like necessarily always negatively aligned, or to think of any of these terms neatly mapping onto each other that way, because a lot of this is sort of like, very like situationally dependent and contingent, right? So because part of, I guess, maybe this is not making a lot of sense, but part of what makes the master's tools, in the sense of that quote, is that the tools have a defined function that nothing can escape from. And that's what makes them tools and not weapons in this sense. And that part of that comes down into like how they're being used and what kind of unforeseen potential and alliances like lie there. And I think a big component of Deleuze and Guattari is having some kind of curiosity as towards what things can do, as opposed like what are the virtual, things that are there in potential connections, and not just how they've been deployed historically in the past. So I think that general formulation is in some sense like a very non-Guattarian one.
Yeah, can I just say real quick, this will probably be the last response, but Dylan, I did want to say that even in this exchange right here, I'm reminded of that piece that you wrote kind of recently about you're giving a presentation about law, international law, and weapons and tools, and I will say that this did remind me of that a bit, and I'm going to let you have the last word, obviously, but I just want to say this will be the last thing we say, and then we'll wrap up, and everyone can have their Sundays back. But yeah, go ahead, Dylan.
Yeah, I mean, I actually really appreciated Ariel's formulation there, and I think it was a nice kind of succinct summary of the of their program, which I do take to be a like empiricist pragmatist program of trying to find and experiment with the necessary weapons to destroy or at least change the totalizing structures that are causing all these problems in our lives. And not an absolute hostility towards those totalizing structures or the molar categories, but certainly a kind of revolutionary desire to change them for the better through the trying to find and use new weapons. And totally agree with your characterization of them directing us to try stuff, to see what changes emerge, and to throw away what doesn't work and pursue what does. Thanks everyone. This was
Yeah.
really, really fun. I feel like I learned a lot.
Yeah, thank you, Dylan.